Hi, friends. My name is Host Eric. I'm the host of Talking with Famous People. I am a typologist and expert in both political matters and matters of the human psyche. And today I'd like to discuss why it is that our culture wars are best explained by divisions caused by different cognitive function stacks. So, to jump right into it here, let's first break down the different types into these four classes of types: the meta-analysts, analysts, executives, and executors. They're called such because any type has either one physical, one metaphysical, two metaphysical, or two physical functions. It's the first two functions. What does that mean? Well, ENTP, INTP, ENFJ, INFJ, all four of those have some combination of NI, TI, FE, and NE. So an N and a T, or an FE, TI or an FE, right? So the analysts, in contrast, they begin their stack with an N or a TI or an and then what you see here is ESFJ starts with FE, but ENFP starts with NE, ESFJ starts with FE, ISTP starts with TI, INTJ starts with NI. Those are the four metaphysical functions. And then their second function is always physical for the analysts. For ENFP, it's FI, ESFJ, SI, ISTP, SE, INTJ, TE. Executives begin with a physical function, SE, TE, SI, FI, respectively, for those four, and followed up with a metaphysical function, TI, NI, FE, and NE, respectively. For the executors, they begin and follow up with a physical function, so TE, SI, SE, and FI, and then their second functions, respectively, are SI, TE, FI, and SE. So let's look at the next slide here. That was a lot of verbal information to process at once. I'm sorry, I understand. I probably shouldn't have gotten into all of that right then. This is another way to explain it. Executors, and again, that includes ESTJ, ISTJ, ESFP, and ISFP. The executors are unconditional in their approach to the world. Here's an example. Joe's the one to service my car. He's been my guy for years. There's a concrete frame and a concrete test. The frame is the situation specific to me, and the test is familiarity or fondness. So if you're an ESFP or an ISFP, you may make that choice on which mechanic you like best, loyalty, or something like that. If you're an SI user, it may be the guy who's not failed you before, who's proven reliable. Regardless, there's a lack of presumption implicit here that your way is necessarily the best way for everybody, but there's a tendency among these people to kind of put their own cognitive function bias onto people and say, oh, you should use this person because he's the guy I've used for a long time. But they're less pushy with the universality of their approaches than are many other types. So truth being specific to the person is the key thing here. That universality, truths, words, symbols, mappings, and stuff aren't universally meaningful. And of course, among this group are the NI polars, or one of the NI polars, ESTJ, and one of the FE polars, ISTJ, one of the NE polars, ISFP, and one of the TI polars, ESFP. So you can see that being an executor means necessarily you have a metaphysical function in your blind spot. Let's look at the executives. Executives are conditional by nature, which is to say they understand a given outcome as predicated on approval yet to come, so to speak, external to themselves. Here's an example. If we want justice, we need to give Sue the same punishment we gave Dan. So Sue and Dan both made the same crime of sorts, and let's assume it's an arbitrary environment like a school. They both didn't turn in their homework this morning, and Dan got his recess taken away. Well, if we want justice, we need to give Sue the same punishment we gave Dan. The reality is, maybe the teacher knows that Dan's a pain in the ass, and he's always forgetting his homework and needs punishment. Whereas Sue, her bullshit excuse is probably not bullshit at all, totally legitimate. Maybe, that the dog ate her homework is actually believable when she says it. But regardless, we want fairness. If we don't want Dan to be able to legitimately complain about our arbitrariness and our authoritarianness and our autocratic ways, then we're going to have to apply the same principle here. So situations are specific to me. I've got 2 kids who are late to class, or didn't bring their homework, but I'm going to have to apply a universal metric because I'm assuming that things get validated externally. Now let's look at, and remember, if you don't remember who the executives are ESTP, ENTJ, ISFJ, and INFP. Now let's look at the analysts. The analysts, they have an unconditional perspective like the executors, but they have a universalist frame. So what this ends up meaning is they go, the status quo doesn't withstand scrutiny against the universal ideal. Therefore, we should take specific action to move towards that, regardless of whether that action itself upholds our principles. So inequity is wrong, therefore we should tax the rich more, is a perfect example. If inequity is wrong, then how is it a good idea to be unequal in taxing people, right? This is something that analysts will say. Inequity is wrong, therefore we should tax the rich more. Apparently oblivious to the fact that they're saying inequity is wrong, therefore we should be unequal more in the following fashion, and not seeing that as anything contradictory. Because they're not evaluating how they get to the ideal, the means, under the same kind of scrutiny as they're evaluating the ends. Okay, so in this case, you're talking about a universal ideal, and the test is a specific situation. And the prediction status, whether it was a correct prediction or not, is determined by outcomes. Unintended consequences complicate this because you may attain the outcomes you said that you were going to attain, but you may have consequences, disadvantages that are worse than the advantages you've attained. And in that case, it's complicated to say whether the person was correct or incorrect in their prediction, right? Okay, now let's look at the meta-analysts. The meta-analysts are conditional normative. So there are 4 kinds of statements, by the way, in English. Descriptive, predictive, normative, and prescriptive. Predictive is the one we just did with the analysts. Prescriptive is what the executives use, which is to say they give you good advice based on the situation, or bad advice, depending on the nature of the advice. And then descriptive is where the executors live. They like things that are concretely described and concretely tested. If it's not something they can test and verify with their own experience, they don't have a tendency to trust in it. And then lastly, you've got the meta-analysts who are conditional normative. Normative statements are statements about what one ought to do or ought not to do on moral grounds, regardless of any kind of impacts calculus. So, for example, just states ought to eliminate the nuclear arsenals. It's an abstract frame and an abstract test. The frame says we're trying to uphold a universal good, which is we all agree that, in principle, a world in which nobody could die in a nuclear war would be, on some level, preferable to the idea that people can die in a nuclear war. However, the test needs to uphold against a universal rule as well. So, in this case, what the meta-analyst might be arguing is that in order to attain justice, the status of being a just state, a nation like the United States, for example, might have an obligation to unilaterally disarm all its nuclear weapons. Now, on the other hand, another kind of meta-analyst might say, well, we may agree that a universal good is the absence of people dying from violent conflicts, including war, but the actual impacts of nuclear weapons, thus far, the evidence suggests that it's been to minimize the amount of warfare, not to increase it. And they've only been used once in war to kill people, and that was a long time ago. So it would appear that a model that includes mutually assured destruction as a deterrent is grounded at least somewhat in empirics. So if, in fact, your universal rule, which is avoiding death from nuclear war, you said, is is the universal rule, well, then you'd have to distinguish why death from nuclear war is so much worse than death from some other kind of war, or else you won't uphold against your own universal rule. In other words, either explain why nuclear war is so much worse to die from than conventional weapons, or else you're really just arguing it's universally good because it lowers the risk of death from violence. And in order to make that claim, you'd have to establish that, in fact, it lowers the risk of death from violence. And we have plenty of good empirics to suggest the alternative, namely, countries with nuclear weapons basically don't get invaded by other countries. So that's sort of a meta-analyst approach. Now, one of the things about meta-analysts that can be frustrating to other types is there's a willingness to suspend attachment to any real outcome among meta-analysts as long as the processes are done correctly. So I've argued before on many videos, many occasions, that in the status quo, abortion, as we understand it, is wrong. And the reason it's wrong is because the Supreme Court predicated its status as a constitutional right on the faulty notion of a right to privacy that does not exist except as a legally created fiction. So, in other words, if you're going to justify legal abortion, you can't justify it like that. You might justify it in some other way, which would be appropriate, such as ownership, that a woman owns her own body, and therefore the state has no role in saying what she does with her property. So let's presume, however, that is the reasoning behind which the Supreme Court were to adjudicate the matter. Well, then, of course, that would render the child that is in question in the womb, the early stage of development of an organism that exists within the womb, dependent upon the woman, but an independent entity of the woman, that thing would be property. However, if it were property, then that would require all abortions to get consent from both property creators, namely the man and the woman. Generally speaking, women don't like that idea of having legal abortion that requires, however, to be legal, the consent of the male who made half of the baby. But that's the necessarily implied reality if we accept it to be property. Now, it's not a right from privacy because there is no affirmative privacy right. If there were, I'd have the right to tell you to look away from me at any point in life, and you'd have an obligation to do so, or else you'd be guilty of a crime against me. That's obviously absurd. In public, we know the Supreme Court has already ruled there's no expectation of privacy, and since there's no expectation of privacy in public, it can't possibly be a right. In other words, privacy is predicated on, or privacy follows from property rights. So to the extent that you have the right to privacy to your own body and inside of it, it's because you own it, not because you have a right to privacy. Privacy is one of the privileges you can exercise when you own things, such as your own body. However, that would mean necessarily, if it's a right to privacy that's derived from right to ownership, that the reason the state has no interest in the thing inside of the woman is because it's not yet a person with its own independent interests, but is instead a piece of property. And as indicated, if it is a piece of property, then that would imply the following, that men need to give permission before an abortion is given, the man who half created it. For a variety of reasons, women don't like that. So you take an executive like my daughter, and she basically, even though she's extremely logical, she's an ESTP, and she normally tends to argue on the side of truth, justice, and the American way. She has her opinion about abortion, which is our bodies ourselves, or our bodies. Keep your patriarchal paws off our bodies, or whatever, and simply chooses not to engage with me about the topic any further. Why? Because ultimately, the dominant frame of reference for her is the particular. Namely, she's annoyed that her particular frame of reference isn't allowing her to validate universally, but it doesn't matter because that's instrumental anyway. And that's the same thing with the meta-analyst, is that one of the two universalities is always going to be instrumental. For me, it's logic. So The logic of all of this is instrumental towards conveying good ideas that are my original making, or I have some original hand in anyway, and getting credit for that with my third slot FE. But of course, it's always got to validate as true NI holistically to people externally. It doesn't all have to be logically deducibly provable for my purposes, because I'm aware of the fact that there's still a lot of intuition involved in typology. It hasn't been rendered into all of its machine code yet, and so we've got a realm of discussion that's somewhat interpretive. There's just two last things I want to discuss in this topic, and that is the metaframes of all of those types, which are, and our interpretation of them, which link to the illocutionary and locutionary frames of reference from linguistics. Illocutionary, this term refers to the way a given speech act serves the identity of the speaker. And locutionary, this term refers to the words spoken and meanings thereof. So what I'm saying out loud, that's the locutionary frame. What my motivations are, what it's getting for me in the end, what I'm thinking that I'm not saying, why I'm saying it, all of that sort of stuff, implied stuff that you might infer from what I'm doing, that's all illocutionary frame. Particularism in general links to the illocutionary frame. So I'll hear this periodically. You just want to be right is an example of presuming the primacy of the illocutionary metaframe. Executors and analysts reflexively test against particular interests. Therefore, they assume that behind every speech act is a real and unspoken motivation that subsumes what the words actually mean. In other words, well, the words may mean that, but you're saying it for a reason, and that's what really matters. That's particularism in a nutshell when it comes to dealing with language-based assertions like the ones I'm making. Universalism, on the other hand, links to the locutionary metaframe. Is your position meow or meow? It can't be both. It is an example of presuming the primacy of the external part of language, the locutionary metaframe. Meta-analysts and executives reflexively test against defensibility, and they test against it either via TI or FE. In other words, the meta-analysts all use either TI or FE to, that's not true. They use either TI, FE, or NE, or NI as a tool function. Okay, one of those universalities is instrumental, but the other one's absolute. For executives, only one of them is absolute, and it's the physical frame. The universality is only instrumental. It makes it easier for meta-analysts to deal with executives than analysts because we both agree on the need for a universal tool function to do shit. It's harder to agree on the frame of reference and disagree on the tool than it is to disagree on the frame of reference and agree on the tool. Because once we get to the end of using the tool, we can each apply it to our respective frames of reference. So to test against defensibility, whether it's instrumental or not, it's instrumental in me, it's instrumental in ESTP, it's instrumental in INFJ, it's in some sense it's instrumental. Well, I mean, it's absolute in INFJ, but the defensibility metric that they use is FE, right? And then, of course, for ENFJs, it's NI. If stuff isn't holistically true, it's not useful. So each of these types has their own limitation in how they view the world that links to their function stacks and whether or not they're conditional or unconditional in their basic frame of reference. And so it's like when I say that executives are conditional, they're not conditional in their nature. They're conditional in how they operate in the world. When I say analysts are unconditional, they're not unconditional in their nature. They're unconditional in how they engage with the world. In other words, at the end of the day, statuses don't matter, outcomes do. Words don't matter, realities do. Analysts and executors both agree with that fundamentally because that's how they operate their tool function through the world. Executives and meta-analysts don't agree with that. Executives are kind of splitting the difference, but meta-analysts are over here alone saying the only things that matter are words and maps, and reality is irrelevant. Like, I don't care whether we decide to be pro-life or pro-choice in our policies. I just care that they make sense, that they be consistent, that nobody gets to have their cake and eat it too. You want it to be property, fine. Then you get everything that comes in that bag, and that's it. You want it to be a person, fine. Then you get everything that comes in that bag, and that's it. And, there aren't any other options. You can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't both say, I have a right to privacy. That's why I have a right to an abortion. And yet that does not confer the identity of property onto the thing inside of me, which necessarily confers onto the male generator of the property half the rights to that property. So it's like you can't avoid, you get a bag, right? It has 5 things in it. Or you get the other bag. It has 5 things in it. You can't pick and choose things from each bag. That's the fundamental perspective of the meta-analyst. And that's what matters. It doesn't matter what you're choosing, what the bags are. It matters that you understand that fundamental notion, that you can't have your cake and eat it too. And as long as we're on the same page about that, the meta-analysts don't really give a fuck what happens, which is its own form of handicap, for sure. So thanks for watching. I know that was a lot of information, very TI heavy video. I hope some of the graphics helped a little bit, and probably won't be as popular as my last TI videos, but it was a document I encountered from before. I don't think I made a video off of it before. I decided to make one right now, and this is the product of those efforts. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to eat plenty of cheese.